Jennifer Talley joins me this week to discuss her new book on session beers. This is BeerSmith Podcast number 155. This is BeerSmith Podcast number 155, and it's early September 2017. This week, Jennifer Talley joins me to discuss her new book, Session Beers. Thank you to this week's sponsors, Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine. They're running an amazing deal right now, 20% off your subscription when you use the code BeerSmith2017. Every issue of Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine is packed with articles for homebrewers and beer lovers. And you can read my new column called Ask the Experts there as well. Take advantage of their special deal when you use the offer code BeerSmith2017 at beerandbrewing.com. Again, that's beerandbrewing.com. And also the new BrewVision thermometer from Blickman Engineering. This interactive wireless digital thermometer connects right to your iPhone or iPad and lets you remotely monitor and record temperatures. You can download your recipes right from the BeerSmith cloud and set updates and alerts as you brew. Get the BrewVision Bluetooth thermometer today, another great innovation from BlickmanEngineering.com. Again, that's BlickmanEngineering.com. And finally, BeerSmith software, the industry standard for home and professional brewers that lets you design great beer recipes and brew with confidence. Download your free 21-day trial from BeerSmith.com today. And now let's jump into this week's episode. Today on the show, I welcome Jennifer Talley. Jennifer started her brewing career at Squatter's Pub Brewery in Salt Lake City. She also worked at Red Hook and Russian River, and more recently, she joined the Auburn Ale House. She has more than 20 awards from the GABF and World Beer Cup, and is also a Cicerone examiner. Jennifer, it's great to have you on the show.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. I'm looking forward to talking to you.
So you just released your new book, perhaps the definitive book on session beers through Brewers Publications, I believe. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
I the editor of Brewers Publications, which is an arm of the Brewers Association, called me up, Christy, about a year and a half ago, and asked me if I'd like to write a book on session beers. Probably because of all the session beers I've brewed throughout my life, and I'd never written a book. My father was an author and a sports writer, but also an author. So it's always something I wanted to do, and I took the challenge.
So this is your first book, huh?
It is. This is my first book, and wow, there's nothing like your first. It was quite an experience. It was fantastic, but it was painful at times. But it was extremely worth it and very fulfilling.
Well, how about we start with defining what a session beer really is? As I understand, it's a pretty recently invented term, right?
Yeah, it is. There's been session beers by definition around since the beginning of beer. So a long time, because beer has a huge, long history. But recently we've started to call them session beers in the brewing industry. I have an opinion, of course, I have an opinion on a lot of things, but my opinion is, we, as craft brewers, we were we did not like brewing quote unquote beers below 5% alcohol for a long time. We were very concerned in the beginning and the dawn of craft brewing back in the 80s about separating ourselves from macro brewing, so the large brewing companies. And one of the ways we separated ourselves was by putting a lot of alcohol into our beer. So there wasn't a lot of lower alcohol craft beers in the market being made in the beginning. I mean, they were there for sure, but we didn't advertise that they were lower in alcohol, and we didn't wear it like a badge or, say that it was special or, crafted, craft-like beer. But now we're feeling a lot more comfortable with our identity, and I think as an industry, and we're getting a lot more comfortable with making lower alcohol beers and selling them as great craft beers. So I think that's kind of why we're starting to see session beers come into craft a lot more.
So when did the session beer term actually come into play? When was it started up?
Well, the first use of session beer term was when I did the research for the book. What I found was by Michael Jackson, and back in 1982, he referred to a Helles beer as being, sessionable as a session beer, and that was in his pocket guide to beers. But you didn't really hear about it much. I mean, that's kind of the first written that I could find about the word session. People have used it in conversations for a long time. The entire time I've been in the industry, it's really, really a sessionable beer. But so it's been around. And then Full Sail really made a splash when they named their beer session. And I think after that, it started to pick up speed because it was actually on a beer label. So, and then we had the development of the session beer category with the Great American Beer Festival and the World Beer Cup, and so it started to really take steam in around 2007.
And
10 years ago.
Go ahead. Oh, I'm sorry. And
yeah, it's about 10 years ago.
10 years ago, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
What I was wondering is, can you define session beers for us? Is it just merely a low alcohol beer, or is it more formal than that?
It's not just a low alcohol beer, because you can have a low alcohol beer and just for a matter of drawing a line in the sand. I define session beers as below 5% ABV, because you kind of have to draw a line somewhere. Does that mean a great German Pilsner at 5.1 is not a session beer? No, of course it is. But for the purpose of definition, I drew the line around at 5% ABV. And that's also under the guidelines of the Great American Beer Festival. When you're judging the session beer category, it's at 5% as well. But to define a session beer, it's not just low alcohol, because you can have a low alcohol beer at 4%, 3.5%, 4.5%, 5%, and it not be made well, not be of high quality. Maybe fermentation didn't go well. Maybe they used way too many hops and it was way too bitter and it overpowered everything else in the beer. And you can barely even get through a pint. That's not a session beer. By definition, a session beer has to be highly drinkable. You have to want more. You have to want more. You have to. You know what? I'll have another one. Can I have another? That's really important to be a session beer. It has to be drinkable.
I always want more, so that's not a problem. But
oh, you always want more of good beer.
Yeah, that's true. I have had some bad ones in my time.
You don't want more of bad, exactly. And I'm not. There are.
I've dumped a few batches too in my time.
Those are not session beers.
More than a few. More than a few.
There you go.
What's made him so popular recently? I mean, we've seen a real explosion in the number of session beers popping up, at least commercially, in the craft beer industry.
Well, my take on that is brewers love to make what they want to drink. They don't want to have to go to another brewery to buy their beer. They want to go to their cooler in their brewery and bring their beer home and drink it, put it in the refrigerator. I always thought that if I had my own brewery, I'd have my specialty, my line of beers would be called the refrigerator series or something like that, because you want to brew what you want to drink at home. As a brewer, we're kind of selfish that way. And brewers drink a lot of beer. But to drink a lot of beer, having lower alcohol as an option is really important. So right now, my refrigerator is filled with Gold Country Pilsner for Labor Day weekend, because it's 5% and it's 95 degrees out here in Grass Valley. So I want to have a lot of pre-prohibition lager around. So the rise of session beers right now is, I think craft brewers are feeling a lot more comfortable brewing lower ABV beer and feeling proud of it and making really high quality craft lower ABV beer. And I think customers, our craft beer customers, want that. They want beer that's easy to go to the river, easy to go to a ball game. So they want it in a can. So we're seeing the rise of canned beer, canned craft beer. And we're also seeing the rise of lower ABV beer. When I say that, I mean below 5%, whereas craft has typically been 6, 6.5, 7, and above. And it's you can drink more of them. You can have 4, 5, 6 in a night instead of 2 or 3, and feel fine in the morning and do whatever you need to go to your daughter's soccer game or go to work or whatever it is. So people are warming up to the fact that, hey, it's kind of nice to be able to drink more beer, because craft beer enthusiasts, there's one thing we all share: we love to drink beer. So being able to drink more of them because the ABV is lower and you're still getting amazing flavor is a positive thing.
Well, you've got an interesting section in the book on the history of session beers, which of course goes well beyond 1982, certainly. Can you tell us a little bit about
Yes.
some of the classic session beers, perhaps?
Well, yeah, absolutely. You know, the funny thing is when my friend Guido works in a very famous Kolsch brewery in Germany. And when I called him up to discuss, because Kolsch is a very famous German session beer, I said, you know, I'm writing a book on session beers. And he said, oh, excuse me, Jennifer, but what is a session beer? But when you look at German beer culture, over 90% of the beer sold in Germany is under 5%. So they don't have a definition for session beer because session beer really is just beer to them, really, you know, very well-made quality beer. Um, so it's kind of funny when I asked Guido about it, who makes Kolsch, he had no idea what the term meant because he's just made a fantastic session beer his whole life and just always called it Kolsch. So Kolsch is a very famous one over in Germany. In Belgium, the wit beers of Belgium are incredibly sessionable and are fantastic wheat Belgian beers.
Yeah, that's what I drink in the summer mainly.
Oh, it's fantastic. Garden being one of the most popular ones, but we have an amazing one here in the United States. Allagash makes a great white. The session beers made back in England that really steamrolled a lot of great lower ABV quality beers being brewed. The bitters of England, dry Irish stouts of Ireland. You know, taxation had a lot to do with the reason why they lowered the ABV over in England after the Free Mash Tun Act in 1880, where the taxes and the levies on beer were shifted from raw materials to alcohol. The brewers realized, well, the lower alcohol we put in the beer, the less we're going to get taxed and the more we'll put into our pocket and back into our brewery to make better beer. So that inspired them to make lower alcohol beer, but they still believed in great and high quality beer. They just reduced the alcohol. So taxation had a lot of influence in the 1900s. And also, beer is a large part of culture in America as well, but also in some of the older countries, in Germany and England, where Germans will be drinking beer instead of coffee on their way to work. So it's very difficult to drink a imperial stout and then try and go to work. So you'll see people, you know, Germans at a kiosk drinking a Bavarian Weiss beer on their way to the office, and that's very common. So it's such a part of culture and such a part of daily life. Having a lower alcohol beer to drink it makes a lot of sense.
Nice. Well, Europe, of course, played a really important role in this. Can you tell us maybe a little bit about Belgium, for example? We haven't talked a lot about that.
Sure. One thing that the Belgians did was they had the party-guile system where they would, you know, mash in a large amount of grain and they would make several beers off the same mash, trying to utilize all the sugars available to them and get the most for their money. And the first runnings would be their triple. And that means the first wort they pulled off the mash because it's the highest in the residual extract or the extract of the brew. So then the second runnings would be their double. And then the third ones would be their table beer, their lowest alcohol beer, or their single, also known as Eckel. So it was very common to do in Belgium to have the party-guile system. And that was one way of making lower alcohol beer. It's not the greatest technique. I wouldn't suggest it at home. I would suggest brewing to gravity because a lot of times when you run your mash over and over again, you'll start to extract some astringent, flavors from the husk material that is in the mash.
Tannins, right?
Tannins, exactly, and they're harsh, and they don't create a highly drinkable beer. So this is not a process that I suggest one does at home, but it helps kind of explain a little bit of the historical context of how some of these lower alcohol beers and how they came about were made.
Well, let's talk about brewing a session beer. What are some good? Let's start with styles, for example. What are some good styles for getting started, maybe in a session beer at home?
My suggestion would be, since so many people are fans of IPA, and I myself as well love them, I would start with a session IPA, because I think making a German Pilsner it's a much more difficult task. The less you put in your beer, the more all of your process can show and display errors. So let me try and explain that. There's nothing to hide behind in these lower alcohol beers. Alcohol is a major flavor constituent and component of a beer. If you take that alcohol and you reduce it below 5%, and you maybe get it even to 4%, everything that you've done as a brewer, home brewer, professional brewer, doesn't matter, a brewer, is right there in front of you. It's right on your palate. So if fermentation didn't go perfect, if your extractions or your pHs in your mash weren't on, maybe you dumped way too many hops in there, it's all going to be really obvious from a sensory analysis component. So the German Pilsner being probably the hardest beer in brewing to make, because it is so naked as a beer and so delicate. The balance has to be perfect. So my suggestion would be to start with something a little bit more forgiving, like either a dry Irish stout, because you have that roasted barley that can help, build up some flavor. Or a session IPA, where the dry hopping of it is going to also, if you did have any errors or problems in your process, dry hops and hopping after fermentation is complete is a great way to mask some off flavors that might have been present. You can sometimes mask them that way. I'm not saying that you're not going to make a great beer, but if you do flub up, it's going to be a little bit more forgiving. So my suggestion would be a session IPA or a dry Irish stout.
And dry Irish stout, I guess, talking to that, Guinness is a fairly low alcohol beer, surprisingly, right?
Mm-hmm.
The draft version,
Absolutely.
anyways.
Yes, I do. I talk quite a bit about the birth of Guinness, and it's probably the most popular dark session beer in the world. I think Garrett Oliver said in his Encyclopedia of Beer, 10 million pints of Guinness are served every day around the world. It's a lower alcohol stout, a lot of roasted barley, very low alcohol, about 4%, and nitrogenated to make it nice and creamy and smooth. So the nitrogenation will be a little bit more tricky at home, but could be done if you have a gas company where you can get a can of nitrogen.
Mm-hmm. Or the mix. You can buy the gas mix, I know.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So Jennifer, when you're sitting down to formulate a recipe or develop a session beer, what are some tips that you'd have for someone just looking to get into it?
I think my biggest tip for anyone looking to get into brewing session beers is to focus on the quality and their process of their brew day and of their fermentation. Really think about your yeast and your yeast pitch, and I would suggest liquid smack packs are wonderful. Dry yeast is actually getting to be really good as well, but just whether it's dry or liquid, make sure it's healthy and you've got a really nice, vigorous fermentation. Like I always say, wort is made in the brew house and beer is made in the cellar. So even though your brew day goes really well, it's equally or even more important that fermentation is strong and you come out with a high quality beer. Also, watch overbittering your session beers. You want to be below 45 IBU. Anything below 5% ABV, it's very difficult. If you start getting too much bittering units in your beer, it can overpower all the other flavors because it's a delicate beer because of the low ABV. So be careful not to overbitter your session beer.
And one of the questions I had is how do you get a lot of flavor and depth into a beer that has a pretty small malt bill, really?
Absolutely. One of the things that I've always done is I've always tried to build a little bit of Munich malt into the recipe, about 10 to 20% Munich malt. You can actually make 100% Munich malt beer, but no matter what the style is, German, English, Belgium, American, I would always put about 15% Munich malt, Munich 1, which is about below 10 Levy bond color, into my formula that helps to build the body. Another key component of building body, enhancing mouthfeel for session beer, is to use calcium chloride instead of calcium sulfate. Calcium chloride enhances and gives you a larger mouthfeel, and as opposed to calcium sulfate, which tends to dry it out a little bit. So calcium chloride is a really good tip in brewing session beers.
Interesting. What does the calcium chloride actually do for you? It's
well, you need to add calcium to your mash. It helps with pH. It helps with run over.
Yeah.
It also, you want to have a certain level of calcium in your beer, and most public water systems have very low amount of calcium. So, adding a little calcium into the mash and then adding a little bit more into the kettle, because only 40% of your calcium that you add into the mash actually carries over to your finished beer. You lose it in the mash, but it's good to help with the pH. So add a little into the mash and a little bit more into the kettle. I think John Palmer and his How to Brew book goes really into doing those calculations at home, and they're very simple. And he's got some really great instructions in his book on how to get calcium in there. But you have a lot of choices as a home brewer. You can pick sulfate. There's all different ways to get calcium in there. And so when you're doing session beers, have a little calcium chloride at home, because that's the choice you want to make when you're brewing below 5%. And it really helps the mouthfeel.
Nice. Well, in the last few years, we've seen the rise of modern interpretations of the session beer. I was wondering if you might want to talk about some of those, for example.
Well, the most modern interpretation of the session beer would be after 1900, or in the late 1800s, when we were brewing here in America, the American Premium Lager. Now, this is not craft. This is big macro beer. But, it's hard to argue that once they're really, really cold and it's a really hot day and you're mowing your lawn, if they're well made, which they usually have very good processes at these macro breweries, they can be highly sessionable. But when talking about craft session beer, the session IPA is really what's making the biggest splash. And I think the craft beer drinkers and enthusiasts are loving hops so much more these days. However, once again, they love to drink a lot of beer. So this is our way as craft brewers to make these lower ABV beers, but also present these amazing new hop varieties that that the growers are giving to us and presenting to us, and getting these tropical flavors of mango and peach and all these great new hop flavors into a beer without overpowering the pint with alcohol. And so you can have 3 or 4 or 5 of them throughout the night and not be, toast in the morning or that night. So I think the session IPA is making a huge splash.
Yeah. And the IPAs, it's taken over the West Coast almost completely now, right?
Yeah.
I was out there.
Huge. They're everywhere.
Yeah. I was out there a while ago. I couldn't hardly find anything to order except IPAs, really.
Yes, it's true. It is true. So it's kind of a nice way to have another offering on tap to satisfy all those people that are falling in love with hops, but so they can have a couple of them and not be floored.
Well, you have some topics on drinking and sensory analysis of session beers, and of course you're a Cicerone as well. Can you provide some tips on how to judge your session beer?
I will have to correct you a little bit. I have not been certified as a Cicerone. I'm actually an examiner for the master level exam. So we put those, it's okay. We put those guys through such the ringer. I would hate to say, I'm certified as a Cicerone. I've been hired as an examiner to go out in Chicago. And so I put them through the test. I have not personally
You put them through the ringer then, right?
I put them through the ringer.
Exactly.
But I've been a Great American Beer Festival judge since 1997 and a World Beer Cup judge. So I've been working in sensory, my whole career over the last 20,
So I think it's fair to say you know a little bit about it, right?
I know a little bit about tasting, judging, and making beer, craft beer. The same sensory analysis needs to go into your session beer as it does any beer. You need to use all your senses, your aroma, sight, taste, flavor. But once again, low alcohol does not make a session beer. High quality and drinkability makes a session beer. Of course, it has to be lower than 5%, but once again, I just keep focusing on quality of the beer. And so when you're judging a session beer, there's nothing to hide behind. I said it, I think earlier in the interview, you need to be very careful to not have any off flavors present in that beer. That means that fermentation, those mash pHs, your boil length time, your bittering units, everything's in balance. So balance would be the key word in producing a great session beer, and also in judging or giving a sensory analysis to your session beer. Is it balanced? Do I taste a little bit of the malt or the hop? Is the hop bitterness nice, and is it pleasant, or is it harsh, or is my beer astringent? Did I run over too long and pull off some astringent flavors from the mash? So really focusing on all the balance and everything that goes into making a beer. And I talk in length throughout the book about different techniques that both professional and home brewers can do to tighten all of those processes up.
Nice. Well, of course, the second half of your book provides recipes of session beers, many of them taken directly from commercial breweries. How did you manage to get that to happen? How did you manage to get the recipes from many of these commercial breweries?
I called my friends. So like I've been in the industry for a long time, and when it came to getting recipes, I just basically thought about all the people that I knew and all the breweries and all my friends really that I've traveled with and judged with, and called on for advice, or they've maybe called on me. And I said, hey, I'm writing a book on session beers, and I love your beer. So can I put it in the book? So some of the recipes to highlight would be, Allagash White, Firestone Easy Jack. I also have Jolly Pumpkin Bam beer. And these are my friends that love drinking session beers, and they know my love of session beers. So when it came time, they're like, of course we want our recipe in your book. So it was actually pretty easy. That was really a fun part, to be able to connect with all my friends.
And of course, you've scaled many of these down to homebrew scale. Can you give us a couple examples of beers that folks might be familiar with?
Well, like I mentioned, I have Easy Jack and Allagash White. I also have Bam beer from Jolly Pumpkin. I have Go-To IPA from Stone. So Fancy Lawnmower beer from St. Arnold's. And there's, so I try to, session beers is there's such a wide scope. It spans from dry Irish stouts to Kolsch of Germany to, lower alcohol Belgian pale ales, to American premium lagers or pre-prohibition lagers. I had to pick a wide variety of beers to demonstrate throughout the book to give a taste of session beers to everyone.
And you used to work at Russian River as well, right? So I think you got a couple of theirs in there.
Yep, there I have the Odd Blonde in there, which is a one that they serve at the pub, and it's just, I end up drinking quite a bit when I'm over at Russian River. I love the sours that they make, and I love all the, Pliny. I mean, who doesn't love that beer? It's fantastic, and I really enjoyed working there and brewing it. But once again, I'm 130 pounds, so a little hard to drink all night long. So I would often turn to the Odd Blonde, and it's a wonderful beer, wonderful session beer.
How did you decide which recipes to include in the book? How'd you narrow them down then?
It really was personal preference. Beers that I've always appreciated, beers I've tasted and fallen in love with over my career. And once again, I had certain styles that I wanted to highlight. A dry Irish stout, beers of England, Germany. I wanted to make a really give a wide scope to the depth of session beers and how the span of all the different flavors and all the different styles that fall under session beers. And it's really vast and really large. And really the book could have been a lot larger in scope, but I wanted it to be digestible as well, and drinkable. It needs to be highly drinkable. So
yeah, I got a copy here. It's not too bad. It's a couple hundred pages, I think, something like that.
Exactly. So I wanted to make sure that I gave a really nice broad sweep to. So I thought about, okay, I want to profile a Kolsch. Well, Fancy Lawnmower beer is one of the best Kolsch's produced commercially in the United States. So that was pretty easy. So I would just think of a style of beer and say, okay, what's one of my favorite session IPAs? Well, Easy Jack is one of my favorite session IPAs. So that's kind of the process. It wasn't really too high tech.
How do you think your experience as a professional brewer helped you writing the book here? And I just looked, it's 230 pages roughly.
I think my entire career is poured onto these pages. I basically drew from everything I've been doing my whole life professionally. And it really kind of led me up to this step of writing this book. because when I was at Squatters, I brewed session beer because it was the law. And I was 21 years old, and the state law was anything on tap, and it is still today the same state law, has to be 4% ABV or below to be on draft. So I had 14 taps that I had to fill every day, every week, and every year, with a diverse selection of session beers. Now that's how I learned to brew, and I didn't call them session beer. It was just beer because that was the law. It was 4% or it wasn't on tap.
Which state was this? Is this?
It's the state of Utah.
Oh, Utah. Okay, there you go.
Yeah, so I was in Salt Lake City for 20 years, my first 20 years in brewing. And so that's all I brewed. So it really is how I learned to brew, which was a very, very fortunate and very lucky and completely unplanned. At 21, not much is planned. And so, well, for me, it wasn't planned. It was just really happenstance. And so I learned to brew.
That was Squatters Pub Brewery, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep, I started in 1991. And left there in 2011. So all I brewed was session beers. So my whole focus was how to make high quality beer and make it diverse so someone could have a dark beer and a hoppy beer and a Pilsner, but they're all the same alcohol. So it really enhanced, I think, my professional brewing techniques by being given this restriction of 4%.
Yeah. So can you provide a couple closing tips or suggestions for homebrewers that want to get into session beers? Obviously, I'll plug the book here. It's Brewers Publications, Session Beers is the name of the book. But can you give us a couple closing tips?
For the closing tips, I would say it's probably going to be one of your most challenging beers you make is to make a really great session beer because the alcohol is not there. So start with a lower original gravity and get a nice healthy fermentation. Do not leave too much residual sugar in there and extract in there. So you want to be, on the Plato scale, somewhere between 2 and 3 Plato. And make sure you focus on quality ingredients, quality process, and balance. Don't overbitter your session beer. And if you're making a session IPA, utilize dry hopping techniques to drive that flavor and aroma. Don't just hop burst it all in the end because that can leave like a harsh, lingering, bitter flavor if you put too much of your IBUs, your bittering units, all at the end of boil. I know it's a very common technique and a lot of people are doing it. I'm not a huge believer in it, and I talk about that in the book on the quality of bitterness you're driving.
I pretty much stopped doing that actually now. I hardly ever do that anymore.
Nice
I put in a single boil edition, and then I'll either go to the whirlpool or go to the dry hop because you don't get much out of it, really.
Refreshing. You don't, and you have to put so much in, and the kind of bitterness you get, I really believe, especially in a lower alcohol beer, is very harsh. Me and my peer Dan Burek that used to brew these session beers together called it tongue grabber. It's almost presents like an astringency, but it's really a harsh bitterness. And it can come from that hop bursting at the end of boil. So really be careful about where you're getting that bitterness and how you're utilizing your hops if that's a major role of your session beer. And focus on your fermentation.
And I think we're seeing more people do a lot more hops in the whirlpool now, right?
Don't forget that your whirlpool hops do add bitterness. If you're over 175 Fahrenheit in your kettle or your whirlpool, you are extracting bittering units. So just because they're in the whirlpool doesn't mean you're not getting bitterness from them. So make sure that if you're still at 175 F or above, you are isomerizing alpha acids, and you are getting bitterness from those hops. So take that into consideration when designing your recipes.
Yeah, I have. That's actually built into the software now, BeerSmith software at least. I have that in there, so that's good.
And the BeerSmith software was I have to add, was so helpful to me. I was really at a loss on what I was going to do for these conversions. I've always just brewed professionally and I brew in percentages, and I know how to make a 10-barrel batch of beer, but how to scale it down to 5 gallons, I was like, oh my gosh, this is going to be challenging. So the BeerSmith software was fantastic, and I couldn't have done it without it. That's for sure.
Well, thank you for the plug. I appreciate it.
It's true. So,
well, Jennifer, is there anything else you want to add here?
No, I think that's it. I hope everybody, if you pick up a copy, I hope you enjoy it and it helps you make better beer, better session beer.
Well, Jennifer, thank you very much for being on the show. Really appreciate you being here.
All right. Thank you. Thanks for having me, Brad.
And again, today my guest was Jennifer Talley. Jennifer is a professional brewer with over 20 GABF and World Beer Cup awards. She's also author of the new book, Session Beers, Brewing for Flavor and Balance from Brewers Publications. Thanks again, Jennifer.
Thank you.
Well, a big thank you to Jennifer Talley for joining me this week. And also thanks to Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine. Every issue is packed with great information for homebrewers and craft beer fans. Take advantage of their fantastic sale and get 20% off when you use the offer code BeerSmith2017 at beerandbrewing.com. And Blickman Engineering, creators of the innovative new BrewVision wireless thermometer. Remotely monitor your brewing system from your iPhone or iPad, record data, set alerts, and grab recipes directly from the BeerSmith cloud. The BrewVision thermometer, another great innovation from BlickmanEngineering.com. And finally, BeerSmith software, the industry standard for home and professional brewers, that lets you design great beer recipes and brew with confidence. Get your free 21-day trial today from BeerSmith.com. Thank you for listening. I hope you have a great brewing week.